When Karen used a vernacular that I often use, specific to the accountability system and the direction that it has taken of late, moving too fast, going too far, in my opinion, skipping absolutely necessary steps that would ensure reliability and validity, when that happens in an unfettered, unmitigated way, lacking accountability at some level of state government, I think we have a problem. That is why I took pride in leading the effort. I take pride in continuing to be a voice on this issue. And I'd like to tell the board very quickly and the listening public the main reasons why. Number one, we all know that the administration of the FSA, the FCAT replacement, did not take place without challenges. I was shocked as I attended and testified before the State Board of Education that there was commentary made to the State Board members by the Department of Education that suggested otherwise. That suggested, in fact, the administration from a technological perspective did not face significant challenges. I don't know what state they were talking about, but I recall, not just once or twice, us having to suspend the test administration online for the entire day because of blank screens, stop and go issues, because of cyber attacks of the state as well as our own servers. Secondly, despite our recommendations and demands that the Department of Education engage in a study and analysis to determine whether or not the technological issues, glitches, led to variance in testing results, they failed to do it. They basically concluded that the results were fine because, and I quote, because their analysis of student data based on reports from districts suggested that there was no variance. Here's the problem. We never submitted the names of students impacted by the technological glitches other than the students who were taking the actual writing assessment. We were never requested to submit names of students or schools where 100% of students were not able to log on or logged on and then they were booted off the system. The second main concern goes back to the very beginning. A state that adopted the FSA late to replace the Common Core assessment that they had originally selected, PARC. In a rush to put together an assessment, they basically adopted questions from Utah because those were aligned to Common Core standards that mirrored or were fairly similar to Florida's. They did not field test those questions or the assessment as a whole in the state of Florida. They field tested only some questions in Utah to legitimize the issue of validity, and then they rushed to administer the assessment. Well, the administration process itself was flawed. The composition of the assessment and the statistical analysis for reliability and validity were inadequate, and now we are the recipients of the results. And as expected, we have seen a dramatic fall, not just here across the Miami-Dade, but across the state of Florida. Yesterday's A is today's B or C, possibly. Today's C is tomorrow's D or F, possibly. The department is rushing now to establish new cut scores that then will lead to new achievement level data that will designate A, B, C, D, or F for schools, and then consequently use that data to inform FAM scores that will influence teacher evaluations. At some point, obviously, it is the intent of the state to, in fact, publish school grades. And I have a problem with that. And I close on this issue. The biggest problem is this. Everybody started last school year without knowing what the rules of engagement were. Teachers taught to a standard that they believed their students would be assessed on. It is now known that some of the alignment of the standards to the questions was less than 100%. the validity study done by Alpine suggested that, in fact, for an assessment with this high-stakes accountability expectation, the administration of the FSA failed to deliver on the expected rigor for such an assessment. That statement alone should cause the department to question moving forward. And then we come to find out that the state indeed plans to move forward with the release of school grades devoid of 50% or more of the data that usually influences school grades. Learning gains. Why doesn't the state have learning gains? Because this is the first administration of this assessment. To have learning gains, you need two sets of data that are comparable, 2 years of FSA administration. And the state doesn't have that. Nonetheless, despite the pleas of those who understand statistics, the state decides to move forward and release school grades, even though statute clearly says that to provide school grades, you need learning gains, and statute clearly delineates what those learning gains are. So for an elementary school, 63%, for an elementary school, 63% of the data that would typically be used to generate a school grade is absent, which means only straight performance, 37%, will influence a school grade in an elementary school. Why should this make me angry personally and disappoint all of you? In a high poverty, high diversity district like Miami-Dade, where we currently teach 79,000 English language learners, where 75% or more of our kids live at or below the poverty level, we know that performance, static performance, is insufficient. Despite the best efforts of principals and teachers, failing to recognize how kids arrive at our schools and to measure their gains over 1 year's worth of teaching and incorporate that into the calculation of the school grade, failure to do that provides an inadequate and incomplete snapshot of what kids learned during that time period, particularly knowing how many ELL students we have and the fact that they will not demonstrate proficiency at the same point, same period, same time as native speakers. That is why we took this position. That is why we have encouraged other state associations to take a position. This is probably the most important issue facing all of us. The fight is not over, but I can tell you the state seems to be pretty adamant in moving forward as quickly as possible, even in the face of incomplete, inadequate, possibly corrupted, invalid, and unreliable data. Now, some of my colleagues across the state have been warned about consequences for us having taken a position. I think I know well the will of this board. And I think I understand well the expectation of this community. Teachers teach, kids learn. We have a responsibility to be honest about capturing that. And if there was ever a time to pause a process, to press the pause button, this is the time. So we've made a number of recommendations. One of the recommendations is, look, I know statutorily you are mandated, compelled to issue a school grade, but don't issue a school grade that is potentially flawed or incomplete. At best, you'll have 50% of the data. How about the learning gains? So the recommendation is either don't release school grades, but if you feel compelled to release school grades, give every school an incomplete, because you have incomplete data. If you're still not satisfied with that, look, by the time school grades are given to schools, will be so late that students will actually be sitting to take another exam. What an inspirational move, right? So late, either give it an incomplete or let the schools keep the grades they have right now and publish the performance. And wait until the next year, until you have 2 years of comparable data to move forward. Now this seems pretty logical, right? It seems pretty reasonable, right? Well rooted in statistical practice. Why wouldn't somebody listen? Why wouldn't somebody listen? What are we afraid of? What's there to be lost by doing the right thing? What is the rush to somehow once again provide an inaccurate scarlet letter on some schools that we can absolutely predict which ones those would be? So if I sound angry, I am. If I sound disappointed, I am. And I know I share the sentiment of this board, that we value our kids too much, we value our teachers too much, we value our schools too much to allow unfair practices to impact this beautiful thing we do call public education. So if there was ever a time to stand for something, this is the moment. And that's why 67 superintendents have spoken loudly. The School Boards Association have taken up the issue. The floor of the PTA has joined, and many, many, many others. They need to hear that this is unfair, it is incorrect, and it must be rectified. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much.